Within the grand dining hall, the sharp clatter of silver against fine-boned china echoed like a judge's gavel, underscoring Beatrice's isolation. Banished to the edge of the wedding feast, she sat entirely alone, her faded silk gown a stark contrast to the surrounding sea of diamonds and imported French lace. She was little more than a ghost, the ruined daughter of a disgraced house, invited only to serve as the family's cruel amusement. Just as the predatory men of the Tun began to circle her lonely table, a sudden shadow fell over her porcelain plate. A gloved hand gripped the back of her chair, and a voice rough enough to vibrate through the floorboards issued a low command, "Stay close to me." The Beaumont country estate in the heart of Devonshire was ablaze with thousands of beeswax candles, casting a golden, forgiving glow over the aristocrats of London high society. It was the autumn of 1888, and the wedding of Clara Fitzroy to Lord Henry Beaumont was the undisputed event of the season. To be absent was to invite social exile. To be present was to witness a grotesque display of wealth. Orchids, imported from the East Indies, spilled from silver vases, and the heavy scent of roasted pheasant and expensive French perfumes hung thick in the air. Yet, for Beatrice Kensington, the golden light of the ballroom felt like the blinding glare of an interrogation room. She sat at a small, round table pressed firmly against the drafty eastern wall, positioned strategically behind a massive marble pillar. It was a table meant for poor relations, elderly spinsters, and the socially damned. Tonight, Beatrice was its sole occupant. 3 years ago, her father, Lord Arthur Kensington, had been one of the most respected earls in England. But Arthur was a man of ambition, and ambition in the new industrial age was a dangerous master. He had invested the entirety of the Kensington fortune, along with the leveraged estates, into the grand transatlantic railway expansion. When the market collapsed in the Panic of '85, it took Arthur's wealth, his reputation, and ultimately his life. He was found in his study with a discharged revolver, leaving Beatrice, a penniless orphan, drowning in an ocean of his debts. Since that day, Beatrice had lived on the bitter charity of her aunt, Lady Margaret Fitzroy. Lady Margaret had ensured Beatrice was invited to her daughter Clara's wedding, not out of familial love, but as a living prop, a cautionary tale for the younger debutantes, and a ragged foil to make Clara's triumph shine all the brighter. Beatrice smoothed the skirt of her sapphire blue dress. It was 6 years old, the silk carefully turned and restitched by her own hands in the dim light of the servants' quarters. She kept her eyes fixed on her untouched plate of venison. If she did not look up, she did not have to see the mocking glances of her former friends. She did not have to see Clara, radiant in ivory satin, holding court at the high table. My. A solitary bloom in the shadows, a voice slithered over the lively string quartet music playing in the background. Beatrice's spine stiffened. She knew that voice. It belonged to Lord Thomas Sterling. Sterling was a man whose wealth was entirely outmatched by his cruelty. He was an industrialist who had bought up the majority of her late father's debts. For 2 years, he had held the promissory notes like a guillotine over Beatrice's neck. He was a thick-set man with a ruddy complexion, smelling of stale cigar smoke and expensive, heavy cologne. He pulled out the chair beside her without asking permission, the wood scraping harshly against the marble floor. "Lord Sterling," Beatrice said, her voice tight but remarkably steady. "I was unaware the seating arrangement had been altered." "The seating arrangement is for cattle, Miss Kensington. I sit where I please," Sterling replied, leaning in too close. His breath was warm on her cheek, smelling of brandy. "I must say, I am surprised Lady Margaret allowed you out of the scullery tonight. Though, I suppose every glittering jewel needs a dark velvet backdrop to truly shine. You play the part of the tragic pauper perfectly. If you have come merely to insult me, my lord, you have achieved your goal. You may return to the champagne now," Beatrice said, keeping her gaze straight ahead. "Insult you? Hardly. I am a man of business, Beatrice," he murmured, dropping the formality of her title. "And the business of the Kensington debt is far past due. Your aunt has informed me She will no longer cover the interest on your father's follies. Come Monday, the magistrates will be seizing what little personal effects you have left, including your liberty, I should think. Debtor's prison is a rather damp place in the winter. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. Aunt Margaret had promised to hold Sterling off until the new year. She had lied. However, Sterling continued, his hand sliding across the linen tablecloth to cover hers. His grip was entirely too firm. I am not an unfeeling man. You are stripped of your title, your wealth, and your prospects. But you are still a remarkably beautiful woman. A private arrangement could be made. A small townhouse in Mayfair. An allowance. The debts forgiven. The implication hung in the air, vile and suffocating. He was asking her to become his mistress. If she refused, she would face prison and absolute ruin. If she accepted, she would surrender her soul and her body to a man she despised. Beatrice tried to pull her hand away, but his thick fingers locked around hers like a vice. Think carefully, Beatrice, Sterling hissed, his smile dropping into a menacing sneer. No one in this room will save you. To them, you are already dead. You have exactly nowhere else to go. The lady, a deep, resonant voice cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom, is currently engaged. Lord Sterling froze, his face paling as he looked up. Beatrice, her heart hammering against her ribs, turned her head. Standing behind her chair was Silas Blackwood, the Duke of Westmore. The Duke was a phantom of high society, a man discussed in terrified whispers, but rarely seen in the gilded ballrooms of London. He was an aristocrat, yes, but he had spent his youth in the coal-dusted valleys of the north, turning his family's dwindling estates into an empire of steel and shipping. He was ruthlessly pragmatic, fiercely private, and dangerously powerful. He stood at least 6'2", dressed in immaculate, stark black evening wear that eschewed the overly embroidered styles favored by the other men in the room. His features were sharp, carved from granite, and his dark eyes were currently fixed on Lord Sterling with the intensity of a predator assessing a very small, very foolish mouse. Sterling hastily released Beatrice's hand, stammering, "Your Grace, I did not realize you were in attendance, or that you were acquainted with Miss Kensington." "There is much you do not realize, Sterling," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an absolute, terrifying authority. "For instance, you do not seem to realize that your grip on Miss Kensington's hand was unwelcome, nor do you realize that your presence at this table is offending me." Sterling swallowed hard, his ruddy complexion draining to a sickly gray. "I was merely discussing a matter of business with the young lady. The business of the Kensington estate is no longer your concern," Silas stated, his dark gaze unblinking. "I hold the notes. You held the notes," Silas corrected smoothly. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, my solicitors finalized the purchase of the entire Kensington debt portfolio from your holding company. You were paid a premium. I suggest you go spend it. Elsewhere." Beatrice's breath hitched. She stared at the Duke, her mind spinning. Silas Blackwood had bought her father's debt? Why? They had never even been formally introduced. The Duke of Westmore operated in the highest echelons of global commerce. The Kensington debt, though crippling to her, was pocket change to a man of his stature. Sterling, utterly outmatched, and suddenly realizing he had lost his leverage over Beatrice, scrambled to his feet. He offered a stiff, humiliated bow. "Your Grace, Miss Kensington." He turned and practically fled toward the far doors of the dining hall. Beatrice was left staring up at the imposing figure of the Duke. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had traded the wolf for a tiger, and she had no idea what the tiger wanted. Silas looked down at her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic indifference. But there was a sharp, assessing quality in his eyes, as they swept over her faded dress and pale face. "Are you unharmed, Miss Kensington?" he asked. Yes, thank you, Your Grace," Beatrice managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. She smoothed her trembling hands in her lap. "But I must confess, I am entirely bewildered. Why would you purchase my father's debt? This corner is entirely too drafty for a conversation of consequence, Silas said, ignoring her question. He stepped around the chair and offered her his arm. Stand up, Beatrice. She hesitated. To walk into the center of the room with the Duke of Westmore would draw the eyes of every single person in the estate. It would drag her out of the shadows and hurl her into the blinding spotlight of societal scrutiny. I cannot, she whispered, looking down. My aunt placed me here for a reason. I am not fit for the main tables. Silas leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a low rumble that was entirely private, meant only for her ears. You sat alone at this feast while vultures circled you, waiting to pick your bones clean. You can stay in the shadows and let them destroy you. Or you can take my arm and walk into the light as a woman under the absolute protection of the House of Westmore. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity. Stay close to me. It was not a request. It was a lifeline. Beatrice looked at his offered arm. The black wool of his sleeve looked like the strongest thing she had seen in 3 years. With a deep breath, she placed her small, gloved hand on his forearm. The moment she stood, the Duke led her away from the dark corner. The effect on the room was immediate and dramatic. As they walked toward the center of the hall, the lively chatter began to die down, replaced by the fierce, urgent buzzing of whispers. Fans paused in midair, glasses were lowered. Beatrice felt the heat of 100 stares burning into her skin, but Silas moved with the unhurried, predatory grace of a man who owned the earth he walked upon. He did not look at the guests. He simply parted the sea of aristocrats by virtue of his presence alone. They reached the high table, where Clara and her new husband, Henry Beaumont, were seated. Lady Margaret was there as well, her jaw practically unhinged at the sight of her disgraced niece on the arm of the most powerful duke in England. Your Grace! Lady Margaret gasped, rising so quickly she nearly tipped her chair over. What an unexpected honor! We did not think you would grace us. And, Beatrice, whatever are you doing? Lady Margaret, Silas said, his tone devoid of warmth. I found Miss Kensington's seating arrangement to be inadequate. I will require a chair for her beside me. Beside you? Clara blurted out, her perfectly painted face twisting into an ugly expression of jealousy. But your Grace, she is not in a position to... Silas turned his dark gaze upon the bride. Clara instantly snapped her mouth shut, wilting under his stare. A chair? Now, Silas commanded, looking at a nearby footman. Within seconds, a velvet-lined chair was brought and placed directly to the right of the Duke's seat at the center table. Silas helped Beatrice into the chair before taking his own seat. He signaled for a servant, who immediately rushed forward to pour them fresh wine. Beatrice sat entirely rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. She was sitting at the high table, beside the Duke of Westmore, across from her aunt, who looked as though she had swallowed a lemon, and her cousin, who looked ready to commit murder. Drink your wine, Beatrice, Silas murmured, not looking at her as he cut into his own meal. You look as though you are marching to the gallows. I feel as though I am, Beatrice whispered back. You have just declared war on my family, your Grace, and I still do not know why. The feast continued, though the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to deeply tense. Every pair of eyes in the hall kept darting toward the center table, trying to decipher the enigma of the Duke and the ruined Earl's daughter. Silas ate with measured precision, occasionally engaging in polite, terrifyingly brief conversations with the men seated near him. He kept Beatrice firmly within his orbit, ensuring her glass was full and casually deflecting any probing questions directed at her. You asked why I bought your father's debt, Silas finally said quietly, leaning slightly toward her as the dessert plates were cleared away. The orchestra had begun to tune their instruments for the evening's dancing. I did, Beatrice said, finding her courage. She turned to look at him. Up close, she noticed the faint silver scar running along his jawline, a stark reminder that this was a man who had not lived a soft life. You are a man of calculated investments, Your Grace. A ruined woman's debts offer no return. That depends entirely on what the woman is worth, Silas replied, his eyes dark and unreadable. Your father, Lord Arthur, was a fool in the financial markets, yes, but he was an honorable fool. Before the crash, he discovered a discrepancy in the railway contracts, a severe case of embezzlement that was destined to ruin not just him, but hundreds of investors. He was going to expose it to Parliament. Beatrice stared at him. He never mentioned this to me. He was trying to protect you. Before he could bring the evidence to light, the crash happened. The men responsible engineered the panic to cover their tracks, and your father was left holding the ruin. Silas picked up his wineglass, swirling the dark red liquid. I have been hunting those men for 3 years, Beatrice. They defrauded my family's ironworks of millions in the process. And Lord Sterling? Sterling was a middleman, a brutal, stupid dog who fetched the scraps, Silas said coldly. Buying his portfolio of your debts gave me access to his private ledgers. It was the key I needed to unravel his network. Beatrice felt a cold realization wash over her. The fairy tale shattered before it had even begun. Silas Blackwood had not swept in to save her out of romance or chivalry. She was a mechanism, a byproduct of his corporate vengeance. I see, Beatrice said, her voice dropping a fraction of its warmth. She pulled her posture perfectly straight. So, I am merely collateral in your war. You bought me just as you bought the debt. Silas turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed his face, something dangerous and intense. I did not buy you, Beatrice. I liberated you, he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. And you are far from collateral. Before she could process his words, the conductor tapped his baton, and the opening notes of a sweeping Viennese waltz filled the ballroom. Clara and Henry Beaumont, the bride and groom, took to the floor for the ceremonial first dance. Clara smiled triumphantly, spinning in her ivory dress, desperate to reclaim the attention of the room. Silas stood up and offered Beatrice his gloved hand. The Duke of Westmore does not dance, Beatrice said, quoting the well-known society gossip. The Duke of Westmore does exactly as he pleases, Silas countered. And right now, it pleases me to show the entirety of London that Beatrice Kensington is no longer a ghost they can ignore. Beatrice hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. He led her onto the polished mahogany floor. When he pulled her into his arms, the sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. His hand rested firmly on the small of her back, burning heat through the thin silk of her old dress. As they began to move, sweeping across the floor in perfect time with the music, the room around them seemed to blur. Silas was a masterful dancer, guiding her with a strength that required no effort. Smile, Beatrice, Silas murmured, his lips close to her ear. Your aunt is watching, and she looks as though she might burst a blood vessel. Despite herself, Beatrice let out a small, breathless laugh. It is cruel to taunt them, Your Grace. Call me Silas, he commanded softly. If we are to be partners in this game, we must dispense with the formalities. Partners? Beatrice asked, looking up into his face. You just told me my father's debts were a key to your ledgers. What further use could you possibly have for me? Silas spun her smoothly around the edge of the floor, drawing her slightly closer. Sterling was a middleman, Silas repeated. But the architect of the embezzlement, the man who truly destroyed your father and stole my iron, he is in this room. Beatrice's breath hitched. Who? Silas's gaze shifted over her shoulder. Beatrice followed his eyeline, landing directly on the center of the dance floor. The groom? Silas whispered darkly. Lord Henry Beaumont. Beatrice stumbled slightly, her heart dropping into her stomach. Silas immediately tightened his grip on her waist, keeping her perfectly upright and in rhythm with the waltz. Henry? Beatrice gasped, softly, staring at the handsome, smiling face of her cousin's new husband. But the Beaumonts are incredibly wealthy. They are old money. The Beaumonts were wealthy. Henry's father lost it all decades ago. Henry has been sustaining the illusion of the estate with stolen funds. The very funds he drained from your father's railway project, Silas explained, his voice hard. He married your cousin Clara today not for love, but because Lady Margaret's dowry is the only thing keeping his creditors from discovering his bankruptcy. Good God, Beatrice whispered, the magnitude of the deception washing over her. Clara, arrogant, cruel Clara, had just shackled herself to a sinking ship commanded by a thief. I need access to the Beaumont estate. I need to get into Henry's private study to find the master ledgers, Silas said, his eyes returning to her face. And as a man who famously despises social gatherings, I cannot simply invite myself over for tea. But you, I am family, Beatrice realized, the pieces falling into place. As the bride's cousin, I have an excuse to visit the estate, to stay with them. Exactly, Silas said. They ruined your father, Beatrice. They threw you into the shadows and left you for the wolves. I am giving you the power to tear their empire down to the foundation. Will you help me? The music swelled to a crescendo. Beatrice looked into the dark, relentless eyes of the Duke. She was no longer a victim, sitting alone in the dark. She was holding on to the most dangerous man in England, and he was offering her the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a choice. What do I have to do? Beatrice asked, as the final notes of the waltz echoed through the grand hall. 2 weeks after the wedding, the heavy iron gates of Beaumont Hall loomed before Beatrice, like the jaws of a trap. The estate, nestled deep in the rolling hills of Sussex, was a sprawling Palladian mansion of pale stone and dark, ivy-choked windows. To the outside world, it was a monument to the enduring wealth of the Beaumont bloodline. To Beatrice, armed with the Duke of Westmore's dangerous secrets, it was a house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. Her arrival had been orchestrated with chilling precision. Following the wedding, Silas had quietly ensured that Lord Stirling's financial threats against Lady Margaret materialized just enough to cause a panic. Desperate to maintain her own lifestyle and entirely unaware of the Duke's machinations, Aunt Margaret had eagerly pushed Beatrice off to serve as Clara's companion and household manager. It was framed as an act of charity, saving Beatrice from the streets while providing Clara with unpaid, obedient labor to manage the massive estate. "You will keep your head down, Beatrice," Lady Margaret had hissed as she shoved her niece into the carriage. "Clara is a viscountess now. Do not embarrass her with your tragic disposition." Now, standing in the grand foyer, Beatrice handed her worn wool cloak to a surprisingly sullen footman. The house was freezing. Despite the bitter November chill creeping in from the moors, the massive fireplaces in the receiving rooms stood dark and empty. "Beatrice." Finally, Clara's voice echoed down the sweeping marble staircase. The new Viscountess Beaumont descended, draped in heavy emerald velvet. But the triumphant glow of her wedding day had already curdled into something brittle and exhausted. "The servants here are completely incompetent. Henry says they are traditional, but I call them lazy. You must organize the kitchens immediately. We are hosting a hunting party this weekend." "A hunting party?" Beatrice asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "So soon after the honeymoon?" "Henry insists," Clara said, her eyes darting nervously toward the closed oak doors of the East Wing. "He says it is vital for business. Investors from the London Stock Exchange, some representatives from Coutts Bank, and, well, he wants to impress them. You will make sure the silver is polished." "Of course, Clara," Beatrice murmured, bowing her head. As Clara swept away to berate a maid, Beatrice's gaze lingered on the heavy oak doors. Henry's private study, the nerve center of his deceit. Over the next 3 days, Beatrice played the part of the invisible, downtrodden cousin to perfection. She cataloged the linens, scolded the butcher, and moved through the house like a shadow. But her eyes and ears were wide open. She noticed the subtle, damning details of the Beaumont ruin. The fine paintings in the upstairs galleries had been replaced by clever replicas. The expensive French wines in the cellar were mostly empty bottles, pushed to the front of the racks to hide the bare shelves behind them. And then, there was Henry. Lord Henry Beaumont played the role of the affable, generous aristocrat flawlessly in public. But in the quiet moments, Beatrice saw the mask slip. She saw him pacing in the library, chewing on his thumbnail as he read telegrams from the Baltic Exchange. She heard him shouting at his solicitor in hushed, vicious tones about extended lines of credit and delaying the Rothschild agents. He was a man drowning, thrashing violently to keep his head above water. The hunting party arrived on a dismal Friday afternoon, bringing a fleet of carriages and the raucous noise of wealthy men expecting to be entertained. Beatrice was standing in the shadows of the drawing room, organizing a tray of sherry glasses, when the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The lively chatter of the bankers and aristocrats faltered. Standing in the doorway, shrugging off a magnificent black greatcoat, was Silas Blackwood. He looked entirely out of place among the soft, powdered men of the ton. His presence was harsh, elemental, and utterly commanding. Henry rushed forward, his smile practically plastered to his face, though Beatrice could see the faint sheen of nervous sweat on his brow. "Your Grace!" "Duke Westmore," Henry exclaimed, offering a deep bow. "We are deeply honored. We did not expect, that is, your telegram arrived only this morning. I found myself in need of country air." "Beaumont," Silas said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the room. His dark eyes swept the crowd, dismissing them instantly, before landing unerringly on Beatrice in the corner. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "And I hear your estate offers excellent sport? The best in Sussex, your Grace, Henry Preened. Please allow me to introduce you to..." Unnecessary, Silas cut him off smoothly. He walked past the sputtering Viscount and made his way directly to the small table where Beatrice stood. The room fell into a stunned silence as the most powerful industrialist in England stopped before the ruined, penniless cousin. "Miss Kensington," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "You are looking remarkably well for a woman subjected to country living." "Your Grace," Beatrice replied, sinking into a perfect curtsy. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Welcome to Beaumont Hall." Silas took a glass of sherry from her tray. As his gloved fingers brushed against hers, he slipped a small, tightly folded piece of parchment into her palm. "I find myself parched," he said loudly, before leaning in a fraction of an inch. "Midnight," he breathed, so quietly she felt it rather than heard it. "The conservatory." He turned on his heel and walked back toward the sputtering hosts, leaving Beatrice clutching the hidden note, her pulse racing with a terrifying mixture of fear and absolute thrill. The midnight air in the glass-domed conservatory was thick with the scent of decaying orchids and damp earth. Beatrice stood shivering in a dark woolen shawl, hiding behind a massive, overgrown fern. The house had finally gone quiet, the aristocratic guests having drunk themselves into a stupor in the billiard room hours ago. A shadow detached itself from the gloom near the glass doors. "You are punctual," Silas said, stepping into the meager moonlight filtering through the glass ceiling. He had discarded his formal jacket, wearing only a black waistcoat and a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms dusted with dark hair. He looked less like a duke and more like the ruthless brawler he had been born to be. "And you are entirely reckless," Beatrice whispered fiercely, stepping out to meet him. "Henry was watching you all evening. He is suspicious of your presence. Let him be suspicious. Fear makes a man careless," Silas said, stepping closer. In the dark, isolation of the conservatory, the sheer size of him was overwhelming. "Have you located the ledger?" "He keeps the study locked at all times," Beatrice reported, looking up at him. "He wears the primary key on a chain around his neck. However, I spoke with the housekeeper under the guise of organizing the polishing schedule. There is a master key to the east wing. It is kept in a lockbox in the butler's pantry, but the butler has been in a gin-soaked sleep since 9 o'clock. Silas's eyes gleamed with genuine admiration. "You are a remarkably dangerous woman, Beatrice." "I was taught by a remarkably dangerous man," she shot back, though a flush crept up her neck at his praise. She pulled a heavy brass key from her apron pocket. I acquired it an hour ago. We have a narrow window. Henry is currently in the smoking room with the men from Coots Bank, trying to convince them his shipping investments are sound. Then lead the way, Silas commanded softly. They moved through the darkened, silent corridors of Beaumont Hall like ghosts. Beatrice's soft slippers made no sound on the Persian runners, and Silas moved with a predatory silence that belied his massive frame. They reached the heavy oak doors of the study. Beatrice slipped the brass key into the lock. It turned with a sharp, heavy click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. She pushed the door open, and they slipped inside, Silas gently closing it behind them. The study smelled of expensive cigars, leather, and desperation. Silas immediately moved to the heavy velvet curtains, drawing them tightly shut before striking a single match and lighting a small brass oil lamp on the desk. "Search the drawers," Silas instructed, moving toward a massive iron safe built into the stone wall. "The ledger won't be in the safe. He needs to access it too frequently to balance his lies. It will be hidden somewhere close at hand." Beatrice moved behind the grand mahogany desk. She pulled open drawers, finding nothing but unpaid bills, empty promises from creditors, and threatening letters from a shadowy syndicate in London known only as the Iron Consortium, the very men who had stripped Silas's family of their mills. "Nothing," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly. "Just debts." She paused, running her hands along the underside of the central drawer. Her fingers brushed against a small, hidden latch. She pressed it. With a soft click, a false bottom dropped open. Inside sat a thick, leather-bound book with no title. "Silas," she breathed. He was beside her in an instant. He took the heavy book, opening it under the dim yellow light of the lamp. His dark eyes scanned the columns of numbers, his jaw tightening so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Here, Silas pointed to a column dated 3 years prior, the Transatlantic Railway expansion. Millions of pounds diverted from the central fund into a dummy corporation. The Cornwallis Trading Company. Cornwallis? Beatrice frowned. That was my aunt's maiden name. Silas looked at her, his expression grim. He turned the page, pulling out a folded piece of heavy vellum that had been tucked between the leaves. He unfolded it and laid it flat on the desk. Beatrice leaned in. It was a letter, written in elegant, sharply slanting handwriting that she had known her entire life. "Henry, Arthur has hired private investigators. He is close to discovering the missing funds from the railway project. If he goes to Parliament, we are all ruined, and Clara's dowry will vanish. You must ensure he is silenced before the weekend. Do this, and the Cornwallis Trust and my daughter are yours. Margaret." The air in the room vanished. The walls seemed to tilt inward. My aunt, Beatrice, choked out the words tearing at her throat. She ordered it. She told Henry to silence him. Her father hadn't committed suicide out of shame. He had been murdered. Murdered by the man sleeping 2 floors above her. Orchestrated by the woman who had taken her in and treated her like dirt for 3 agonizing years. A ragged, desperate sob broke from her lips. She swayed on her feet, the horror of the betrayal shattering her entirely. Before she could collapse, Silas's arms were around her. He pulled her flush against his chest, his embrace fiercely protective, shielding her from the physical blow of the truth. He smelled of cold air, sandalwood, and steel. "I have you," he murmured fiercely into her hair, one large hand holding the back of her head, pressing her face into his shoulder to muffle her cries. "I have you, Beatrice. Breathe." She clung to the lapels of his waistcoat, trembling violently. "They killed him. They stole everything. And then they made me serve them. They made me watch them spend his blood. And now we will drown them in it," Silas vowed, his voice a lethal, vibrating promise. "I swear to you, Beatrice, I will tear this house down brick by brick, and I will leave them with nothing but ashes." Suddenly, the heavy sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, the sharp, uneven tread of a man who had consumed too much brandy. "Henry, he's coming!" Beatrice gasped, her panic overriding her grief. Silas's eyes darted around the room. There was no secondary exit. He quickly blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into absolute darkness. He shoved the ledger and the letter inside his shirt, pressing them flat against his chest. Behind the heavy drapes, Silas commanded, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the alcove window. They slipped behind the thick, dusty velvet just as the handle of the study door rattled. A key scraped in the lock, and the door swung open. The heavy scent of brandy and cigar smoke entered the room, followed by the unsteady silhouette of Lord Beaumont. He carried a silver candelabra, the three flickering flames casting long, sinister shadows across the walls. Beatrice stood frozen, pressed entirely against the cold glass of the window, with Silas standing directly in front of her. His large body completely shielded hers. She could feel the steady, calm beating of his heart against her chest, a stark contrast to her own frantic pulse. He reached down in the dark, his fingers lacing through hers, gripping her hand in a silent command for absolute stillness. Henry staggered toward the desk. He set the candelabra down, cursing under his breath. He pulled open the center drawer, his hands fumbling in the dim light. Beatrice held her breath until her lungs burned. If Henry checked the false bottom, he would realize the ledger was gone. He would lock the doors. He would call his armed gamekeepers. Henry's fingers scraped the wood of the drawer. He paused, his head tilting as if listening. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, with impending violence. Silas shifted his weight slightly, his free hand dropping silently toward the silver-handled hunting knife. Beatrice knew he kept strapped to his thigh. He was preparing to kill the Viscount right there on the Persian rug to protect her. But before Henry could trigger the hidden latch, a sharp, frantic knocking echoed from the hallway. "My lord!" a voice called out. It was the head gamekeeper. "My lord, Beaumont! You must come quickly! There's a fire in the southern stables!" Henry jumped, slamming the drawer shut. "A fire? Good God, the thoroughbreds!" he shouted, grabbing the candelabra and sprinting out of the room, leaving the door wide open in his panic. Silas let out a slow, controlled breath. "A fire?" Beatrice whispered in the dark, her voice shaking. "I told my carriage driver to create a distraction if I was not back by 12:30, Silas said, stepping back from her, though he did not release her hand. "It seems he is thorough." He led her out from behind the curtain and quickly toward the open door. "We have the proof," Silas said, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire as they slipped back out into the corridor. "The ledger gives me the power to seize Henry's assets and the Cornwallis Trust. The letter gives Scotland Yard the power to hang them both." Beatrice looked down at the dark, powerful hand holding hers. Her world had just been shattered, the truth of her father's death a bleeding wound in her chest. But as she looked up at the Duke of Westmore, she realized she was no longer the frightened girl crying in the scullery. She was the architect of their ruin. "What is our next move, Silas?" she asked, her voice hardening into steel. The escape from Beaumont Hall was a masterpiece of orchestrated chaos. By the time Lord Henry realized the stable fire was a mere distraction, a pile of damp hay and oil meant to produce an abundance of smoke but very little actual flame, Silas and Beatrice were already miles away, swallowed by the dense, freezing Sussex night. Inside the Duke's unmarked carriage, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the steady drumming of the freezing rain against the roof. Beatrice sat wrapped in one of Silas's heavy wool blankets, staring at the leather-bound ledger resting on the seat between them. It looked entirely too ordinary to contain the price of a man's life. Silas watched her from the shadows of the carriage, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He did not offer empty platitudes. He understood that grief, when mixed with profound betrayal, was a poison that had to be bled out slowly. "They will hang, Beatrice," Silas finally said, his voice cutting through the dark like a blade. "I will personally ensure the judge who hears this case is one entirely immune to the charms of the aristocracy. Your father's name will be cleared before the end of the month." "And Clara?" Beatrice asked, her voice hollow. "She knew nothing of the murder. I am certain of it. She is too vain to harbor such a dark secret without crumbling." Clara will be left with exactly what she earned, Silas replied coldly. A ruined title and an empty purse. She will survive, as women of her disposition always do. But she will never set foot in polite society again. They arrived in London just as the dawn broke, painting the smog-choked sky over the Thames in bruised shades of purple and gray. Silas did not take her to a modest hotel or a safe house. He brought her directly to Westmore House, his fortress-like mansion dominating a prime corner of Grosvenor Square. For the next 3 days, Westmore House transformed into a war room. Beatrice, fueled by a cold, sustaining fury, sat beside Silas as he mobilized his formidable resources. He summoned his lead solicitor, a terrifyingly precise man named Mr. Abernathy, and Chief Inspector Davies of Scotland Yard, a veteran detective who had long suspected the Beaumonts of foul play, but lacked the physical evidence to breach their aristocratic armor. When Davies read the letter penned by Lady Margaret, his weathered face hardened into stone. Conspiracy to commit murder, embezzlement, and systemic fraud, the inspector muttered, tapping his pipe against his palm. We have enough to hang the Viscount twice over and send the Dowager Countess to Holloway Prison for the rest of her natural life. I do not want them arrested quietly in the night. Inspector, Silas commanded, standing by the massive marble fireplace. Henry Beaumont built his house on public deception. He will be unmade in the exact same manner. We spring the trap tomorrow afternoon. The bait was elegantly simple. Silas dispatched a courier to Beaumont Hall with a sealed letter bearing the Westmore crest. The letter offered a private meeting at Westmore House to discuss a substantial and immediate line of credit to save the Beaumont shipping interests. Knowing Henry was drowning in debt and desperate to keep up appearances for his new bride, Silas calculated the Viscount would cross broken glass for the promise of a bailout. Lady Margaret, ever the parasite, would naturally insist on accompanying him to ensure her own financial interests were secured. They arrived precisely at 3 o'clock the following day. Beatrice stood in the adjoining library, hidden behind a set of partially open, heavy mahogany double doors, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wore a new dress, a dark, perfectly tailored gown of charcoal silk that Silas had ordered from the finest modiste in Bond Street. It was the armor of a woman reclaiming her station. Through the crack in the doors, she watched as the footman escorted Henry and Lady Margaret into the grand drawing room. Henry looked haggard, the dark circles under his eyes betraying his sleepless nights since the ledger went missing, though he tried valiantly to project the arrogant swagger of a lord. Lady Margaret, swathed in expensive furs purchased with Kensington blood money, looked around the opulent room with naked, greedy calculation. Silas was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, pouring himself a measure of scotch. He did not rise when they entered. "Your Grace," Henry said, offering a stiff, overly eager bow, "we came as swiftly as your telegram allowed. I must say, your offer of a financial partnership is, well, it is a testament to your excellent business acumen." "Sit down, Beaumont," Silas ordered, his tone entirely devoid of courtesy. Henry blinked, clearly taken aback by the hostility, but he and Margaret quickly took the seats opposite the desk. "I am a man who despises wasting time, so I will be brief," Silas said, resting his elbows on the desk, his dark eyes fixed on Henry. "I brought you here to discuss a specific asset portfolio, the Cornwallis Trading Company." Henry's face lost all color in an instant. The name hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Your Grace, I am unfamiliar with." "Do not insult my intelligence, Margaret," Silas snapped, his voice echoing in the large room. "And do not bother lying. It is entirely too late for that." Silas reached into the top drawer of his desk and tossed the heavy, leather-bound ledger onto the polished wood between them. It landed with a heavy, final thud. Henry let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, shrinking back into his chair as if the book were a coiled viper. "You lost this a few nights ago, Henry," Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal purr. "A careless mistake. But then, You are a remarkably careless man. You left a trail of stolen Kensington funds so wide a blind man could follow it to your door. That That is a forgery, Henry stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. A fabrication designed to ruin me. I demand to know who gave you this. I did. Beatrice pushed the mahogany doors open and stepped into the light. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Margaret stared at Beatrice as if a ghost had just walked out of the wall. The color drained from her face, leaving her rouge looking grotesque against her pale skin. Beatrice, Margaret whispered, her hands trembling violently in her lap. What is the meaning of this? You are supposed to be at the estate. Organizing the silver, Aunt Margaret? Beatrice asked, her voice steady, cold, and ringing with absolute authority. She walked forward, coming to stand directly beside Silas's chair. Or perhaps you preferred me in the scullery, where I couldn't hear you spending my father's money. You wretched, ungrateful girl, Margaret hissed, her shock rapidly twisting into venomous rage. She pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice. I took you in. I fed you when you had nothing. You fed me scraps from the table you stole from my family, Beatrice shouted, her composure cracking just enough to let the years of agony bleed through. She slammed her hand down on the desk, right next to the ledger. You ruined my father to cover Henry's debts. You engineered the Panic of '85. And when Arthur Kensington got too close to the truth, Beatrice looked at Silas. Silas nodded slowly. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out the folded piece of vellum, and placed it neatly on top of the ledger. Margaret's eyes fell upon her own handwriting. Her mouth fell open, but no words came out. The absolute, undeniable proof of her treason stared back at her. He was your brother, Margaret, Beatrice whispered, a single tear cutting a hot path down her cheek. He was your own blood, and you ordered him slaughtered like an animal to protect Clara's dowry. It was business. Henry suddenly cracked, leaping to his feet, his face twisted in desperate, cornered panic. Arthur was going to ruin us all. The investments were failing. If he had gone to Parliament, the scandal would have destroyed the Beaumonts and the Cornwallis Trust. We had no choice. There is always a choice, Henry, Silas said softly. He did not move, but the sheer, terrifying menace radiating from him caused Henry to stumble backward. You simply made the wrong one, and now the bill comes due. Silas raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The double doors leading to the grand foyer burst open. Chief Inspector Davies marched into the room, flanked by 4 uniformed officers of Scotland Yard. Lord Henry Beaumont, Lady Margaret Fitzroy. Davies announced, his voice booming with the authority of the Crown. You are under arrest for the murder of Lord Arthur Kensington and for grand larceny against the Bank of England and the Westmore Iron Works. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and given in evidence. Henry collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, openly sobbing as the officers hauled him up by his arms. Lady Margaret did not weep. She sat entirely rigid, her eyes locked on Beatrice with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred as the heavy iron cuffs were clamped around her wrists. You think you have won, Beatrice? Margaret spat as she was dragged toward the door. You are still a ruined girl. The Ton will never accept you. You are tainted by scandal. She is under my protection. Silas's voice cut through the air, silencing the Dowager Countess instantly. And anyone who speaks a word against her will find themselves facing the full and mitigated wrath of the House of Westmore. Take them out of my sight, Inspector. The doors closed behind the police, cutting off Henry's pathetic weeping. The grand drawing room was suddenly, violently quiet. Beatrice stood frozen by the desk. The revenge she had dreamt of, the justice she had bled for, was finally hers. The monsters who had destroyed her life were gone, destined for the gallows and the cold stone of prison. Yet she felt hollow. The adrenaline that had sustained her for weeks evaporated, leaving her shivering and exhausted. She swayed slightly on her feet. Instantly, Silas was there. He rounded the desk, his large, warm hands gripping her shoulders, steadying her. "It is over, Beatrice," he said quietly, his thumb brushing away the single tear on her cheek. "They can never hurt you again." "My father is still gone," she whispered, looking up into his dark, intense eyes. "The money, the estates, they will be returned, but I am still entirely alone." Silas looked down at her, the hard, unyielding lines of his face softening into something Beatrice had never seen before. It wasn't pity, it was profound, burning respect. "You are a Kensington," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "You walked into a viper's nest armed with nothing but a brass key and a terrifying amount of courage. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, and you are far from alone." 2 months later, the winter snow had blanketed London in a pristine, quiet white. The trials had been swift and brutal. Henry Beaumont was sentenced to hang at Newgate Prison, while Lady Margaret was banished to the darkest, dampest cell in Holloway. Her aristocratic pride broken by the harsh reality of hard labor. The Kensington fortune, meticulously untangled from the Beaumont accounts by Silas's army of solicitors, was restored entirely to Beatrice. She was no longer the pariah in the faded silk dress. She was one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, a woman who had survived the fire and emerged as forged steel. She stood in the grand foyer of Westmore House, her bags packed and waiting by the door. She had purchased a beautiful townhouse in Mayfair, ready to begin her life anew on her own terms. Silas descended the great marble staircase. He wore his customary black, looking every inch the ruthless, untouchable Duke. He stopped at the bottom step, looking at her luggage, a muscle working in his jaw. "The carriage is ready, Beatrice," he said, his voice unusually tight. "Thank you, Silas," she said, offering a small, genuine smile, "for everything. You gave me back my life. I will never be able to repay the debt I owe you." "There is no debt between us." Silas stepped closer, closing the distance until he was towering over her. The faint scent of sandalwood and cold air surrounded her, making her heart skip a familiar, treacherous beat. "But I find I have a problem, Miss Kensington." "A problem?" Beatrice asked, looking up. "Yes. I have spent the last 2 months working alongside a woman whose intellect matches my own, whose ruthlessness in the face of adversity is staggering, and who is the only person in London who does not bore me to tears," Silas murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. "And now she is leaving." Beatrice's breath hitched. "Silas, I told you once that you were not collateral, Beatrice," he said, reaching out to gently trace the line of her jaw with his gloved finger. "I did not bring you into the light just to let you walk away into another empty house. The Kensington name is restored, but I find I would rather you took mine." Beatrice stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. The Duke of Westmore, the man who answered to no one, was asking her to be his equal. "Are you asking me to marry you, Your Grace?" She breathed, a slow smile touching her lips. "Or is this another calculated merger?" "It is a surrender," Silas whispered, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. "The only one I will ever make." Beatrice looked at the bags by the door and then back into the dark, relentless eyes of the man who had saved her. She reached up, weaving her fingers into the soft hair at the nape of his neck. "Then I suppose," Beatrice whispered, pulling him down to meet her lips, "I will just have to stay close to you." The aristocracy of London is a beast that feeds on scandal, yet it possesses a remarkably short memory when confronted with absolute power. The tale of the ruined Kensington heiress and the ruthless Duke of Westmore became the stuff of legend, whispered in the gilded halls of Mayfair. Beatrice did not merely survive her public execution at Clara's wedding feast, she orchestrated the destruction of her tormentors and emerged as the Duchess of Westmore, a woman whose wealth and influence rivaled the crown itself. She never returned to the shadows, and no one ever dared to seat her at the edge of the room again. Together, Beatrice and Silas ruled their industrial empire not with the fragile arrogance of old money, but with the lethal, unbreakable bond of two survivors who had walked through the fire. The empty chair in the dark was gone forever. In its place sat a queen, forever close to the man who handed her the crown.